So we're thinking about that, but it's also we're trying to remark on the fact that we have actually had TEEB in existence for 10 years, and that's just my role to basically talk a little bit about the origins of TEEB, where it came from. How do we get to the point that we're in this symposium today with hopefully about 100 people talking about TEEBAgriFood implementation? That hasn't come from nowhere. There's been an evolutionary process, and I'd like to just take some time to discuss how that evolution evolved. That wasn't a very good way of phrasing it. But secondly, beyond that, how the work we're doing today in terms of TEEBAgriFood actually links up with the other parts of the TEEB portfolio, because I think that's important to recognize as well. I think at least that there is a coherence across the work we're doing, but I'm going to present that to you for you to make your own judgment. So the outline of my presentation is, which is now gone. The outline of my presentation is what is TEEB? Why is TEEB working on agri-food? So, little things. Let's see if this works. Why is TEEB working on agri-food systems? And finally, who is in the room and what do we ask of you? Now, Alexander's already begun to touch on that, but I'll discuss that a little bit further. It who is in the room, what do we expect of you? But let me start with what is TEEB. And here, chapter 1 of the aforementioned TEEBAgriFood Economic and Scientific Foundations report, which I authored, was actually trying to talk about the genesis, talking about how the scope and the ambition of TEEB. TEEB in 2000, when it kicked off in 2008, was very much a response by national governments, a response to the stern review of climate change. Now, many of you in the climate change field will know that the Stern Review of Climate Change, which was sponsored primarily by the UK government, was extremely influential. It was also controversial. It was influential and controversial because what it tried to do was to provide an assessment of the cost of policy inaction in economic terms. So we may, and in fact we do, wish to change and move away from the potential, and I would say perhaps even looming, climate change disaster which faces our generation, future generations. But that is an instinct, a gut instinct. What we wanted to do was move beyond simply that gut instinct, we ought to do something, to actually make a credible economic case for intervention. That credible economic case is based really on scenario analysis. What would happen if we didn't intervene? What is the cost of policy inaction? And then let's add to that intervention options that we could look at, which would then be valued in economic terms. And if we juxtapose the two, we can use multi-criteria decision-making, we can use cost-benefit analysis, but basically there is a strong momentum that's then generated because the economic case for intervening vis-a-vis climate change was made strongly and had continued to be made since that point. So having had the Stern view of climate change, it seemed relevant, pertinent and correct to try to provide an evaluation element, an evaluation project, which was looking at biodiversity. Okay? Now, there are similarities here in the sense that clearly we were similarly trying to look at the cost of policy inaction and are not addressing the biodiversity agenda. Also, in terms of TEEB, did not focus just on the bad news. It's one thing to present policymakers with a kind of abhorrent future scenario. If we don't present them with an alternative, action as opposed to inaction, then our words end up being listened to perhaps, but no response is taken. So TEEB, even from its outset, was looking at policy interventions and action. And part of the work we did in TEEB was on that. But before turning to TEEB in more detail, I just wanted to draw out some of the similarities, but also some of the differences that some of the challenges we face in terms of biodiversity versus climate change. And I think this is a very pertinent discussion just now because I'm often asked, with the New Deal for nature, in terms of biodiversity, why is it that, biodiversity perhaps at this point hasn't had what we might call a Paris moment? Why has it been that we haven't had the equivalent? And one of these is down to the fact that we are talking about a much more complex, in some situation, picture, and the nature of climate change is also different. So the first point I want to make here, what is biodiversity? Well, it's the living fabric of our planet, including all its ecosystem, species, and genes. So already we have something which is at least in 3 dimensions, and is much more difficult to measure in some respects than having the single apex indicator, which is CO2 equivalent in 2050 or 2100. okay, or parts per million. It's almost impossible to think of, although Pavan mentioned some alternatives this morning in terms of IUCN red list, etc., but we can't just take it all down to one number, even if in terms of the political exchanges and dialogues and discourses that we're part of and part of UN environment, it would help us to do so. It's just, in some respects, an intractable and insurmountable problem. We have to just accept that to be the case. The second difference is that, as I said, the carbon sequestration and storage is what we in TEEB would call an ecosystem service, not the ecosystem service. We can, of course, on the basis of intergovernmental panel on biodiversity ecosystem services, at best, we might change the terminology and say that's nature's contribution to people. But in the end, what we're talking about is something very similar. And fundamentally, of course, it's the case that if a project or an intervention improves the situation with respect to carbon sequestration and storage, that's one extremely important outcome. But it's not the sole thing that changes if you compare one scenario to another. Let's take, for example, if we have what has been, kind of very much a rallying call around climate-smart agriculture, if that climate-smart agriculture simultaneously reduces hydrological flows or reduces pollination services or reduces cultural services, we in TEEB, and I think the global community, should be aware of these trade-offs and not push just for climate-smart agriculture. And certainly the red in RED Plus acknowledges the fact that it's not just about that. In order to actually make concrete change in the ground, even in the climate change context, we need to think about the co-benefit and also, in terms of trade-offs, the co-losses that might occur. And having, even from the beginning, even before we have the TEEBAgriFood Universal Framework, before that, the TEEB framework already was in itself universal and comprehensive because it developed this typology of ecosystem services which allowed this trade-off analysis to be applied. So in that sense, again, it's different and more complex than climate change itself, and therefore the Stern Review. Third point, it's almost impossible, well, be careful what I say, there are not many people who would argue against climate change. There actually are some vested interest groups who would actually benefit, of course, from climate change happening. But by and large, we can rally around a situation where we say we don't want climate change. We're in when we talk about valuation, therefore, we're valuing scenarios that have lower climate change. It's very difficult to argue against that. We have a very different problem in terms of TEEB because we're not valuing something which causes an effect, we're valuing the thing itself. We're actually valuing biodiversity, which itself is very controversial. Now, Pavan, I think, many, many times in terms of the TEEB work, and I also, when I joined since 2014, have tried to face this challenge where TEEB has been accused of commoditizing nature. We're basically pricing nature, but we're not doing that. We're not pricing nature. Value has many dimensions to it. You don't have this challenge in climate change because what you're doing is valuing the loss in crops that happened because climate change is occurring. Okay? Everyone can rally around that. Whereas we've certainly had difficulties in UN environment, not in terms of what we're doing, I think, in terms of TEEB, but communicating adequately. And this also applies in terms of translation and how TEEB and how valuation is expressed in different languages, actually trying to convince our audience that we're not trying to commoditize. The last thing that I want to do, Pavan wants to do, or anyone in the TEEB community wants to do, is to suggest that nature is for sale. It very much is not for sale. So that's a different problem to what we faced in terms of the Stern Review for climate change. So we did, with all of that backdrop, we had the first phase of TEEB. And we produced a series of reports. I was actually an author of some of these. I wasn't in part of UN Environment at that point in time, and many people in this room were actually part of the original TEEB community, from 10 years ago. And these reports proved to be extremely influential. They were well received, but not just by the conventional biological diversity, who I'll get onto in a minute, but also by a much wider audience. And we also have in the room today, for instance, I'm trying to find him, Mark Goff, who is the CEO, who's just there, of the Natural Capital Coalition, which was formerly the TEEB for Business Coalition. So the yellow tome you see there, hiding the third one along in the middle there, is a TEEB for Business work. And that's extremely important because what was recognized by Pavan in his leadership role as study lead, but I think also widely by the TEEB community, is that if we want to make an impact, we have to have targeted reports which provide the same key messaging. We're not trying to change our message, but adapt that message in terms of what will people respond to. Okay? So the business community needs something sharp, they need something punchy, they need to know how this is affecting their bottom line. They need to know, why am I interested, why I'm working a 60-hour week, why am I interested in looking at TEEB as opposed to doing my day job? What we need to do, what the Natural Capital Coalition to do, is try to make TEEB their day job. Okay? So the Natural Capital Coalition has had an extremely influential role, and as I said before, it was called the TEEB for Business Coalition. But that's one of the various outputs we had. We also had a targeted response for national government and subnational government, and the blue tome in the dark blue one, which my colleague Pushpam Kumar was the editor of, was the theoretical foundation. So a parallel what we do in TEEBAgriFood, the original TEEB theoretical foundations report. So there was a great amount of press. There was a huge amount of, I think, success around the original phase of the TEEB project. As an academic, it was very interesting for me because as an ecological economist working in the University of Edinburgh, TEEB in some respects wasn't new, in the sense that the ecological economists of the discipline, and we have Peter May in the audience, who is the head of the International Society, ecological economics has been trying to do this work for at least 30 years. But what happened was the TEEB community in our project gave an impetus to this work. It meant it went from the kind of from being discussed in academic audiences, and only within academic audiences, to be in the public domain and actually catalyzing change, which is basically what this and any UN environment project has to do. So I mentioned the CBD, and also it was mentioned by this morning, and I'm presenting, this might seem very strange to present this, because why am I talking about 2020 targets when we're all pushing towards a new deal for nature? Well, I'm mentioning it because this actually, the IT target, this particular one, is important because actually this was, in some respects, stimulated by the work of TEEB, but then also TEEB responded to this, in the sense that we said by 2020, at the latest, biodiversity values have been integrated into national and local development and poverty reduction strategies, and planning processes are being incorporated into national accounting and reporting systems. Okay? So what are the key points there? We're talking about biodiversity values being integrated, and we're also talking about integrating into national accounting and reporting systems. That's very much what TEEB has been about since its inception, and continues to be. Because we're trying to, in terms of TEEBAgriFood, get the business community to integrate this into their accounts. But we're also working, which I'll present in a minute, with the United Nations Statistics Division on ecosystem accounting, and that also is an attempt to basically extend conventional national accounts that take into account ecosystem system extent, to then account for what we're doing. We can't manage what we don't measure. And often we're measuring the wrong things. Okay? So what TEEB is trying to do is provide impetus to a change in what we measure overall. So we were responsible to the IT targets, and we have been very active in the TEEB community in trying to be involved in the next stage in terms of the CBD and the New Deal for Nature, which has been very much spearheaded by the Biodiversity and Ecosystem Branch, and also beyond that with the World Conservation Monitoring Centre, but also much more widely across UN Environment as well. So what are we doing? Well, I mentioned already as an introduction to this, TEEBAgriFood, this symposium, we switched from theory to implementation. In 2013, 2014, when I joined, we were very much in the phase where we're looking to switch towards implementation. So we had a series of interventions. We had the TEEB country studies. So the EU, under the ENRTP project, very generously funded us to look at 5 particular countries and said, you have an approach which is applied ecological economics. It's an approach which is basically trying to look at how we can actually apply what we call the 6-step approach, which is define the policy needs, decide how you're going to apply scenario analysis, where are you going to get the data from, make the case, see the case through to intervention. Okay? So that 6-step approach was then taken forward and presented and developed in 5 countries. And just looking at time, I think I've got time to present, if you don't mind, a 5 minutes or 6 minutes of a clip from a YouTube clip, which is in Ecuador. I've got 3 minutes.
3 to 5.
Oh, to finish? Well, then I won't do it in that case. I thought I was master of ceremonies. I'm now being told off, so I won't do that. Okay. I'll maybe put that at the end, and those who want to stay can present that. But there's a nice clip on our TEEB website for TEEB country studies for Ecuador. But just to summarize, which you may present later on if I'm not told off for being late, what we do have in that particular case study is, for instance, the president standing up, the minister standing up and saying, look, this TEEB report is important. We need to develop this further. We need to develop this in the sense of having evaluation component to the work we do. Okay? And literally a month ago, the same ministry got in touch with us, asked us to review their guidance on applying valuation in Ecuador, and that's going to be taken forward. And the intervention options, say, for instance, in terms of cacao production and socio-bosque in Ecuador, also have had an impact. So I will hopefully, with time, be able to present that in terms of TEEB country studies. But let me just continue with the slideshow and talk about ecosystem accounting, which is the second of the three alternatives, before I turn to TEEBAgriFood. I mentioned this already. We, in Planet Unplugged yesterday, if anyone was at Planet Unplugged yesterday, Pushpam, Alexander, Pavan, Susan, who was sharing, were talking about the inappropriateness of GDP as a measure of our well-being. And its inappropriateness of GDP and national income accounts more generally in terms of trying to assign and act as an indicator of how well we're doing. How well we're doing either in terms of welfare or more broadly in terms of sustainability. As I pointed out yesterday, GDP was never meant to do that. It had a much narrower focus to it. Now, the UN Statistics Division and the UN Statistical Committee in 2012 developed the second of two volumes, which is basically applying what's called, and this is a horrible acronym, the System of Environmental Economic Accounting, Experimental Ecosystem Accounting. All right? Okay, SIA-EEA. And we thought in UN Environment we should be a part of this process. We should be part of the SIA-EEA process for several reasons. The first of these reasons is, whether we like GDP or not, the fact that those same entities, the National Statistics Office, in our case, Brazil, India, China, South Africa, Mexico, so an EU-funded project which is working in 5 of the most mega-diverse countries in the world, and also in terms of global population, we're looking half of the population of the planet. Okay? So Brazil, India, China, South Africa, Mexico. In those countries, when we're speaking to the National Statistics Office, it's the same National Statistics Office that is rubber stamping the GDP figures, that is also rubber stamping the SIA accounts. Now, there are all kinds of issues that we may have in terms of statistics, but there is an incredible potency to our work if the validation is coming from the same statistical office that's providing the GDP figures. Now, if this was simply a case of kind of window dressing or a small adjunct which wasn't important, then we wouldn't be there in this space. I believe it's not, because a lot of what we do is linked to if we're making land use change decisions, it was alluded to by our speakers this morning. If we're making land use change decisions, often we want to know specifically what's happening in this watershed. Our analyses typically need to be spatially specific. Now, we talked also, we're not directly involved in terms of TEEB, but as Pavan mentioned yesterday, our TEEBAgriFood evaluation framework, which will be presented by my colleague Kavita after the break, is based around the same protocol and methodology which is applied in inclusive wealth. Our inclusive wealth report, which is very much championed by Pushpan Kumar, my colleague, is a report which looks at our wealth and looks at all the different component capitals which in sum show us how we're doing in terms of sustainability. The TEEBAgriFood approach mirrors that. It applies that to the agricultural domain. We absolutely are committed in UN Environment to trying to take forward and trying to disseminate and try to make the Inclusive Wealth Report the go-to index to assign our progress. But I think we also need to have SIA, because some decisions are decisions that are very spatially explicit. And in SIA ecosystem accounting, experimental ecosystem accounting, we are looking at ecosystem extent, we're looking at ecosystem condition, we're looking at the ecosystem services that flow from those extent and condition combinations. So we can, for instance, have the National Statistics Office giving us trend data to how forests are being depleted, and as a consequence, the change in ecosystem services that are happening as a result. And that can trigger change. That can trigger at least an intervention such that people come to ask TEEB to provide valuation, do scenario analysis using these new data, and that's exactly what we're doing as part of this project funded by the EU Partnership Instrument for SIA. So just one quick example. Oh, have the slides gone again? Oh, it's gone up. Okay, this is in South Africa, and this already, in terms of earlier work funded by NORAD, has made an impact. A discussion of changes in rivers, extent and condition, has led to a discussion in the DEA, the ministry there, from our work as to how we should address these changes occurred. We are led by an advisory board. Yesterday was an advisory board meeting. This is slightly, now, for the advisory board, they might start throwing things at me. This is the first time I'm doing this, because I'm actually pigeonholing them. So I might get in trouble from Jackie and Pavan and Alexandra and others, okay? But there we are, okay? So on our website, there's a kind of random assortment of listings. So I've done my best to pigeonhole. I've done the pigeonholing partly because I think it's appropriate for you, the audience, to see how we try to configure the board. Okay? So UN Environment has 2 seats on the board. Lygia, the director of Economy Division, has one of the seats on the board, and our previous executive director had a seat, but obviously we are hopefully, we have a new executive director-elect who will be joining us at UNEP. But then we have TEEB study leads. Now, 2 of them are here. Running out of time. I thought it was all right because we were so ahead of the agenda. I'm not. All right, okay, fine. So Alexander Buller and Pavan Sixtev, you've heard from this morning. Now this is complicated because, for instance, Pavan doesn't wear just the hat of TEEB study lead. He also has an institutional role as the president of WWF International. He has also, let's go through that list here, institutional. He has an academic role in terms of he's published in Nature. And even bizarrely, he's the only person who fulfills all these criteria because he's also a funder. So having won the Blue Planet Award, he very generously gave part of that contribution to TEEB. So you actually, sir, have every single hat on associated here. But in case you think he's perfect, he was a banker before he joined. So no one's perfect, okay? So the TEEB study leads. Institutional agencies. So these are the institutional heads of certain agencies. The European Environment Agency, okay? For instance, Christiana from the CBD. Tony Simmons was there yesterday from ICRAF. And Julia Martino-Lefebvre from IUCN. We also have funders, and I wouldn't say just funders, supporters, because funders does them a disservice. So, you know, Guillermo, Humberto have been more than simply the people writing the checks. They've been actively involved in making our progress happen and commenting on that progress. And we also have the business community. Mark is in the audience. Herman Mulder is also on our board, because you recognize very early it's important to have people from the business community. And finally, last but not least, we have academics. Now, Jackie switched in that role here from previously being our UN Environment Head of Science to now being merely an academic, Jackie, in our listing. Okay, so I've been told running out of time. Why is TEEB working in agri-food systems? I mean, hopefully in about 5 minutes cover this. So we had the report which was developed. We developed a report to look at which sectors we ought to focus on if we were to try to intervene correctly, so to speak, and make the biggest impact in terms of reducing externalities and impacts. So if we were to implement change, what should we look at? So we actually commissioned True Cost to do this work. This is before I joined. And what we found was this. If we were to list 20 sectors globally, which have the biggest impact in terms of negative externalities being applied to the global community, if you look at this listing, it's not surprising, but it's an evidence base now. 12 of these 20 are agricultural sectors, right? So therefore, we have the evidence to say there's a material impact. It's not just our gut feeling, but we know there's a material impact of agriculture, and we ought to intervene as a consequence. Pavan mentions the SDGs, and I want to quickly look at those as well. So in terms of the SDGs, clearly we're part of UN Environment. We wouldn't be doing this if we weren't for the SDGs. This is the famous wedding cake depiction of the SDGs, and I think this is very important for TEEB in particular, because TEEB at its core, if you look at the bottom of this cake, is looking at these biospherical, so to speak, SDGs. And the argument here in terms of the wedding cake argument that Rockstrom and Pavan have made together suggests that if we don't get the bottom of this right, if we don't deal with the biospherical SDGs, then we don't have a chance at trying to achieve the other SDGs. And TEEB at its core, the bottom, the kind of heart of TEEB, so to speak, is very much these kind of biospherical SDGs. The next slide I've had on SDGs is this one here, so I've listed them. I hope I've got the current SDGs, maybe some of them I haven't. The only ones that aren't circled are ones that, even for the ones that aren't circled, you could probably find a TEEBAgriFood angle, so to speak. But we're certainly, as Pavan said, we're not just looking at just 1 or 2 SDGs. Agriculture is cross-cutting. The fact that there is an ethical component to what we do. We've always looked at the distribution of winners and losers when we do TEEB work. Okay? Given that's the case, part of these SDGs are actually response to us. We also know, obviously, the gender component to any work we do in terms of agriculture. So I won't go into this in detail because of time, but certainly it's the case that we're looking at many of these SDGs. The one I wanted to flag only is life underwater, because this came up yesterday in Planet Unplugged. As was mentioned, TEEBAgriFood, in terms of its scope of work, does not include capture fisheries, So it doesn't include the oceans. We're hoping to have a separate report which will develop in the coming years for TEEB for oceans and coasts. But it does include the FAO definition of agriculture, and therefore we did commission a report, Inland Fisheries, that's on our website. To some extent, we're also looking at life underwater as well. I presented this slide yesterday, and I know it's one that everyone in the TEEB audience likes. I presented it, so I'm not going to dwell on it. This is basically a schematic look at what TEEBAgriFood does within the farm gate. Okay? Now, what we have here in the bottom left is the core remit of TEEB, and that's why I've circled it. Why are we in this space? Because TEEB for the last 10 years, although now we're looking at all the capitals, TEEB for the last 10 years has really been at the forefront of championing ecosystem services. What we have in this schematic is a representation to say, look, these ecosystem services tend to be invisible. It tends to be the case that we make decisions in all kinds of spheres, be it business, national government, subnational, as individual consumers, which don't take into account the fact that we rely on pollination services, we rely on hydrological services, etc., but we tend to ignore the fact that they are critical to us and are being depleted. We tend to ignore the fact that ecosystem functioning is being hampered by our interventions. You'll see these on the right-hand side here, like habitat encroachment, and as a consequence, ecosystem services are being lost. That's important. That's why we're in this space. Because in terms of agriculture and food, those are often hidden, and therefore we make the wrong decisions. And the reason I've circled these, and I've circled the ones at the top in terms of other, say, cultural ecosystem services like that we have at the top, is that this has always been what TEEB is about. So it's a natural progression for what we've done before. Finally, who's in the room? What do we ask of you? Okay? So who we have in the room, I've listed there the projects that were basically involved and are going to be presenting and hopefully going to be sharing during the course of the next 2 days, have begun that sharing process yesterday already. And again, my thanks to the sponsors in terms of the EC for DG DevCo, EU Partnership Instrument, ICI, and the Global Alliance for the Future of Food, some of whom we hear from later on in the day. Who's also in the room? Now, it might be, this was done kindly by Monica. I asked her, and she did this on Sunday, my thanks to her. I said, wouldn't it be neat to have a slide showing all of the countries that were involved in TEEBAgriFood? Now, so she kind of went over this. We may have missed a country or two. If we're not, I apologize. But this is by kind of region, the countries that have been involved. How have they been involved? Been involved perhaps as coordinating lead authors, as reviewers, as part of our advisory board. So you can see very much from this and from the next slide that, you know, TEEB is a global initiative, and TEEBAgriFood is a global initiative. It has to be, as Pavan said, one of our four areas we try to take forward is transparency and inclusiveness. Okay, the qualities that TEEB has had right from its inception, and that inclusiveness is shown in this map and the previous map. And again, and maybe we've missed a few. We also have included more than 42, I think, or maybe more than 42 research institutes. So again, we're reaching out widely also within the UN community by actually commissioning work, as I mentioned, inland fisheries, but also the rice study from FAO. So we also want to make sure we're inclusive in that sense as well.
Now it's 1 minute exactly.
It is. This is the final slide. Your instructions, okay? So who do we have here? Instructions: share, learn, become part of the community of practice in the next 2 days, and develop a theory of change so we can improve livelihoods and biodiversity outcomes. This is very much what has been said already by Alexander. And I think important that we keep that in mind after this introduction and after we go through the presentations. We are going to have a working exercise, so hopefully by the end of today and by the end of tomorrow, you'll understand scenario analysis, we'll do some invest training, you'll understand how to carry out analyses using human capital and as well as natural capital. We'll also have training on the TEEBAgriFood evaluation framework, and therefore hopefully be geared and ready to go and take this forward and continue to be part of our community. Thank you very much.